This episode, I'm joined by philosopher and negative psychoanalyst Julie Reshe to discuss her book, Negative Psychoanalysis for the Living Dead, Philosophical Pessimism and the Death Drive. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep it running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Julie Reshe, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you, James.
We are going to be discussing broadly negative psychoanalysis, but this is from your book from 2023, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan, which is entitled Negative Psychoanalysis for the Living Dead, Philosophical Pessimism and the Death Drive. And so this is a book, a short, very punchy book, filled with your own writing and then also interviews with Todd McGowan, who's been on the podcast before, and others. And this is a book of psychoanalysis that is critiquing the positive, as in emotionally happiness, positive orientation that psychology and psychoanalysis generally seeks to, or consistently does, draw itself towards as its sort of default position. Have I done it justice there? There's a lot more to it than that, but have I done your ideas justice?
Yeah, kind of. The way I see this book is that it's a failed attempt to reappropriate, in a way, negativity. Mm-hmm. It is failed because there is something in negativity that resists being appropriated. And by appropriating it, I mean make it our own, feel as a part of our existence, not something foreign to us, because current therapeutic framework, current way of thinking about human being, about relationship is quite positive, and it probably was always so. It might be the quality of thinking as such being positive. And in therapeutic perspective now, all the negative states like depression and suicidal thoughts and anxiety, they tend to be seen as something foreign to our existence, to how we're supposed to be feel. They tend to be alienated, seen as inadequate to our existence. And the long tradition of philosophy, especially pessimistic philosophy and psychoanalysis, especially the part of psychoanalysis that I called negative, comprehends it in a different way. It tries to see those negative aspects of existence as genuinely human, as something even constitutive, important to human existence. So not instead of alienating it, trying to reappropriate it, to see it as more human than maybe positive things about our existence. But it's a failed because there is something in this negativity that resists to be fully admitted, embraced. It kind of, because of its annihilative qualities, you cannot touch it directly. Once you touch it, you disappear. There is this dark magic to it. So any attempt to fully show it, to fully embrace this negativity, for example, if you fully embrace suicidal thoughts, guess what will happen? There's going to be no one to show the experience of this. So it belongs to those who are not alive anymore. Maybe the ability to embrace it fully. Even suicide, by the way, doesn't work ideally in embracing it, because it still can be seen as a positive act of trying to find a solution to the suffering of existence. It's still not negative enough. Nothing is negative enough. And especially attempt in a form of book, thoughts, elaborated thoughts, or academic book, especially the one that was accepted, obviously, for publication. That's how it was published. If you can present some coherent thoughts, coherent enough to qualify for academic thinking, that's not proper way of embracing it. But I tried and I failed. That's what book is about.
But in the way that you understand negativity, surely it could only ever be a failure. So it's a good failure.
Yeah, negativity is a failure in a way. We can probably make it a part of our language only in negative terms, negative ways, but still, because while making it part of the language also already gives it positivity. That's how language works because it's inherently, and thinking works, they might be inherently positive. It's quite hard to include anything negative into language and thinking, because thinking resists negativity being included in it, as all negativity resists being included in it.
Do you, I mean, this is something I thought about while reading your book. You mentioned negativity in relation to language. Do you feel the way we've spoken about, the way we speak about negativity, depression, whatever the terms might be, in terms of language, has changed in such a way that forces our relationship with it? So I think about the fact that, many, many years ago, it would be called melancholia, or you would have a melancholic personality, and that seems something that is more open and more broad, as opposed to depression, which seems like just an error of personality.
The problem with depression right now, depression is the most problematic and most positive terms among the rest of the terms that we now use within the therapeutic psychologized language, such as anxiety and melancholia. Because for anxiety, for example, it has its own, if you translate Angst, German, as anxiety, it has whole history with Heidegger, with Kierkegaard talking about it in philosophical sense as structural, important for existence. So now if you include it in DSM as a disorder, it's still there's still history to it. It's still possible to talk about it philosophically, even though it's completely absorbed now in everyday language into the language of psychology. But with depression, it's problematic because it's itself diagnosis. Like if you say that you're depressed, it implies the hope that something is wrong with you. This alienation is at work. Something is wrong. You're supposed to be fixed. There are people who are protocols, professionals who knows how to deal with you, unlike you. Like you are not in the right state of mind. It just means. So the very word, even though it acknowledges negativity in you, but the way you call it and the way you communicate, you're forced now to communicate it to others, is through implying hope and implying your own, you being inadequate and other people who are not depressed being more adequate. Which, and it's strange, like we prefer to hide the fact that those professionals like psychotherapists who are in charge of healing us from our depression, how they are themselves depressed. You're not supposed to admit once you occupy this position, but once in a while you'll hear those kind of news of how it turns out that lots of psychologists, more than other types of people, are depressed, which is strange. And how the more we try to fix depression in a world, the more we try to get rid of what from this diagnosis, from what is called depression, the more it's still in place, the more powerful in a way it gets. So depression, like the way it now functions in our, we can say, positivized language, the more kind of doesn't work. You can see the inherent failure of this way of this kind of terminology. But with melancholia, it's quite better developed philosophically than depression. There is no philosophical history of depression that much. It's quite hard to install philosophically profound way of thinking when you talk about depression. With melancholia, it's easier because this is a term that, for example, Aristotle uses to describe philosophers. Like there's more direct link with the profound comprehension of the world that makes people melancholic. And Aristotle called those melancholic people philosophers. There is link of more profound comprehension of the world, oneself maybe, with melancholia. In the similar way, in Freud, we'll find the association of melancholic way of comprehension oneself with the realistic comprehension of oneself, more profound maybe. So those terms are tricky, the way we use them. They're quite positive, but at the same time, in a weird way, negative.
Mm-hmm. So has this been more, I'm intrigued as to how you got to the point where you explicitly wanted to make this a statement? So was this more a personal journey for you in the sense of that this healing was something that was never found, or was it that on a theoretical and psychoanalytical frame that you looked around and realized, thousands upon thousands of people with depression aren't getting healed in any sense of, reversing that depression, and so this is something we need to acknowledge as a state? So is this more, I guess the broad question there is this more a personal thing or a theoretical thing firstly?
It's both, probably. The other thing, the problematic thing of talking about depression also, or other negative states, that the way we talk about them now, especially in academia or some kind of research setting, is when you're supposed to talk about it from the position outside of it. Therefore, you kind of you see people who are subjects who have depression as something inadequate, and you're supposed to occupy adequate, supposedly, position to talk about it. And I have, for me, this is the problem. Once we are not able, there's impossible in this setting to talk about depression as one own, relating to it not from the distance, from within. There are obvious reasons for this, because this kind of language of depressed person won't fit into academic setting. It would be seen as the symptom, not proper language, not the language to which one is supposed to listen. It can be seen as beautiful, poetic, something like that, but not language that is not aesthetics, not about aesthetics, but about actually something to listen to. So I was trying to combine maybe both, see it through myself, through my own depression, relating to depression of others, not as seeing it as way as adequate, not as inadequate, like it's normally seen as a diagnosis. There's also problematic side what one comprehends as adequate and inadequate, but not the way. There is something for me precious in thinking of depression as my own depression and relating from my depression to someone else's depression without alienating it from myself like it's normally done, because it seems as something objective if you do it if you do it in relation to someone else. Freud, by the way, was quite anxious, but he at least would not talk. Even if he would talk about his own anxiety, he would think of it as a deviation, still find the distance from the anxious Freud and non-anxious Freud. I was trying to do it in different way, but it's quite hard because the very terminology, terms, and the rules of writing are against the whole thing. But maybe here and there I managed to some extent to do it non-professionally.
I have a little question about Freud, but I just want to ask one thing right relatively at the beginning here to get it out of the way. Allow me to play devil's advocate, because I'm sure this is a question you've fielded many times, which is that I think many people who might hear of your book, and when I looked online, there was a few people who had this response, and maybe people listening to this might immediately think, is such a position as negative psychoanalysis or depressive realism, is it simply not this whole idea of if you want to change, you have to change? Is it simply trying to avoid putting in the effort to change and to become something else? Many people might say you're just trying to justify your own misery.
Well, it's a good point, but maybe I do in a way. And it's long time criticized position of depression, associating depression with passivity, not a quite conservative stance, and it's quite a different story from the therapeutic stance and comprehension. Like there would be two opposite camps. one normally representative generation of our parents, my including, that depression is just weakness. You're supposed to do something valuable with your time, occupy yourself with something where there is going to be no time for depression. You'll be productive and happy. And there is the competing camp of therapeutic society, younger generation than my generation is mostly immersed into it, where that's your diagnosis, there is nothing you can do about it, and they would reduce even their whole existence to those medical diagnosis, which I preferred this generation more, this position. Like there is maybe too much of this psychologized language in it, but it has the potential, starting from this point, to make it in a way philosophical, to more reflective about one's existence. It's more interesting than just stigmatization of depression the way this other camp does. So both, in a way, they would stigmatize depression and they would offer something positive in exchange, but in a different way. The generation where depression is laziness and you have to be strong enough to get rid of it and be efficient with your life or something like that, they would stigmatize the negative and alienate the negative, which is depression, in terms of imposing this kind of positive perspective where one's supposed to be efficient and happy and non-depressed. And the other camp, where this medicalized, psychologized language, would claim that it's still alienation, its diagnosis is the deviation from how human beings supposed to be like. There might be some critical turn in this psychologized language, that it's society, capitalist, neoliberal society, that makes us depressed, some kind of injustice going on, and we have to get rid of this injustice that causes depression, which we do. But that's not the point. That's not my point. My point would rather be trying to comprehend depression for what it is without getting rid of it. Like, that's the different thing. And it might be because I'm trying to justify myself. my mom would probably say, or it might be also what the younger generation would claim, that it's philosophizing and giving it aesthetical value, even to something that is just the diagnosis, something that is just saying that you go and consult professionals and don't go deep with your philosophy into it. Well, and I don't listen. I'm like too old for this generation, too young for another generation to be comprehended. But nonetheless, that's what I do for some reason. No one knows why exactly I'm doing it.
It seems like a middle way of being. So if one side is saying, stop laying around, get up and do something, and you won't have time to be taken in by this depression, and the other side is completely defined by it. There's a strange middle way where you are doing something, but you are being the state of depression, or whatever it might be, the negative state that you are, instead of giving yourself over to either side. I mean, this is what interests me so much, is and the engagement, that it seems to me that there's far more damage done, and this might be something that's kind of between the lines or explicit in your book, that there's more damage done in beginning the engagement, in the sense that the way someone is an error or a fault or bad, or to begin the engagement by sort of unconsciously saying the way you are is wrong, seems to do far, far more damage than beginning on the terms, as you were talking about earlier, of this, you can't get outside of it. So, this seems to be far more, to begin on the terms of depression seems to be more sensible and arguably more healing. But I'm sort of with you, so I'm trying not to align, try not to add too much bias in here as a relatively miserable person. So
My generation, I guess.
I think so, yeah. I mean, do you agree with what I said, that it's might do more damage to engage in that sense?
It probably does, and normally the criticism of this, the injunction to be happy that exists in our society, it normally performed from the position of critical theory, for example, normally performed from the position that it damages, it makes us even less happy, even more unhappy than we already are, the demand to be happy. And I'm trying to stay away from this reasoning, even though it's everyone likes science now with the experiments. It was experimentally proven that there is true. If it's more, if there is the injunction, imposition of the demand to be happy, people feel less happy because they reflect or ruminate too much on wherever they encounter negativity or some kind of suffering. They suffer even more because of the demand to be happy. So it's true. But the whole thing, I'm not that much interested in, because it's still quite positive. That's how the tricky way how thinking works. When you try to destigmatize negativity, suffering, saying that it's okay to suffer, trying to undo this logic that the imposition of the happiness does, you still fall into the positive logic. You're still stigmatizing, because it's done with the goal of minimizing suffering, which is like the vicious cycle. It's quite hard. It's not only example with this logic and with this logic of trying of normalizing suffering because it will make us less suffer. It's logic that omnipresent logic that is everywhere when you try to embrace negativity, which is impossible task, strangely. You still find reasons, meaning of suffering, reasons why you do it, like it making someone feel better, or it gives you relief, or the solidarity is my favorite one, and there I cannot get rid of, but I understand that it's still the positive logic of the idea that there is solidarity in embracing one's suffering. So it's tricky how thinking works. In wherever you try to embrace negativity, you still add the positive value to it in terms of it will improve something, it will make us feel better, or be kinder. And I'm doing it, and the book is doing it. And not only, I don't think one would ever listen to someone or write something that doesn't have this positive twist, because that won't be considered even thinking if it's fully negative.
So this is, I mean, with regards to this, and this sort of paradox of the inability to actively, positively give oneself over to negativity being a paradox, you draw on the work in the book, in your book, of Peter Wessel-Zapffe, most notably in English speaking with The Last Messiah, but now On the Tragic has finally been translated, but it's pretty tough work. But this foundation is interesting because for Zapffe, we are, the translation is, our consciousness is a breach. It shouldn't be. It's an error of, it's sort of an overabundance of nature. So the fact that we are conscious of being is nature being, I think he jokingly says, too well endowed actually at certain points. But from this, basically this Zapffian foundation of we really shouldn't be as we are. We're conscious of ourselves as matter, which is a weird state to be. In what sense, I guess again, I'm repeating the question that you've said you can't answer, but what is to be done from this position? But I guess that's the Zappian curse, is that in that knowledge that we know that we can know that we'll never know, we also know that we can never do anything about that either.
Mm-hmm. I see, even though I love Zapffe a lot, and he's my favorite philosopher, and there might be one more layer to his thinking that we don't acknowledge. Normally, as you mentioned, he talks jokingly sometimes, and the whole philosophy, if this is true, this is how he meant it. that would be great. That whole philosophy is a prank, because it implies a certain type of greatness of human being and the parody of the biblical type of writing. But if you add his tragic stance, if you add humor to it, that would be perfect for me. But nonetheless, without this layer, there is a problem with his thinking. Precisely, it's too serious, and by this seriousness, it gives the positivity, the greatness of human being, and the way he acknowledges the tragedy of existence. At the same time, the problematic side that he limits this tragedy to certain quality of human being, of human thinking, and also he limits it to human being as such, as a species. For me, it's not tragic enough if it's limited to a certain quality, only to humans. Like the rest of the world is great, which is not true. I think the horror is it's everywhere. It's not just within particular this quality of and particularly within human being. And the positive thing about Sappho's thinking, even though he's the most negative philosopher, and you can see his philosophy as the criticism of positivity, of everything positive, especially psychiatry and all the structures in society that just promote the positive illusions. But nonetheless, he's himself being anti-natalist. Being anti-natalist is offering solution, even though he's not exactly kill all the people, but stop reproducing. It's kind of, our generation is fine, just let's keep it, but not the next generation, because his reason is too much suffering and too hard, so let's just don't impose. It's still in with the goal of minimizing suffering, still some kind of a solution, and still trying to minimize the suffering. Not very positive, but still positive and tricky in this way. And this idea of limiting suffering to certain quality and a certain type of species, which is human species, and certain type of deers with this overly developed horns. For me, it's not tragic enough. But thinking about a head student from Norway who was related to Sappho, brilliant student, and he claimed that in Norway, Sappho is not that much in favor, because the way he presented it, he was more like a clown. And it makes sense. It gives it something even more tragical if you comprehend his philosophy, his very tragic, serious philosophy that way, that it's a prank. And because if this is a prank, it's meant, then it eliminates the problem of the greatness of human being, because at the same time, as we know from all the pessimistic philosophy, like Dostoevsky, Schopenhauer, and Sappho included, they at the same time, by claiming that we have overly developed consciousness, or there is something wrong with our species, that we're too smart, which just implies we are too smart. We ask too smart questions. We just overthink all the time. And this is what defines human. This is how humans are different from animals. They would at the same time claiming that this is horrible feature and we are less developed, like this is more absurd than with other animals. But at the same time, this would imply the greatness of human species. It's like there is this hypocrisy of claiming that there is something wrong with us, we should not exist, but at the same time, it implies certain greatness. And if Sappho would be better than all of those philosophical pessimists, if this is a prank, you just, you make fun of the very greatness, and your solution is just a joke. There is this idea that I like, that there is more tragedy in humor than in tragedy itself, because the tragic position, according to Simon Critchley, the tragic position implies certain greatness, position of the hero, while in humor it just implies the absurdity without justifying it in any positive qualities like the greatness or anything. Like, not a hero even, it's just pathetic the way Sappho was. to be honest, which is a great thing about him. The other thing, if you want to discuss it, but there's also a problem for me with Sappho and with maybe less, but much more with Schopenhauer, much obvious with Dostoevsky is also there. With all as with all the philosophy that it's against feminism, because and this position of depressive realism, which is just a psychological term for something similar going on in philosophical pessimism, that it's a superior quality, more realistic perception of the world associated with sadness and with negative states of mind. But all those things, if you pessimistic in this way, in a way that we are depressed, we are more depressed than other species because of our overly developed consciousness, or because we have ability to overthink or even just think. If you associate it with this, if you limit suffering and tragedy to this, these qualities were historically associated with male. And this is the problem for feminists. And depressive realists and philosophical pessimists, especially Schopenhauer, for example, like really misogynist Schopenhauer, not depressive realism. They're trying their hard not to be misogynist. But the problem that this implies, and sometimes it's openly would be said, that women are less depressed or less tragic, more happy, more blissed, because they're seen as closer to nature or something, more like animals, which is not true. But still there is this bias that even though you don't say it openly because of its historical association, it still tends to imply that women are more blissed, less because they're less smart. It's not true, but that's how they were comprehended in patriarchal philosophy, which is all patriarchal. But for me, the feminist version of philosophical pessimism and depressive realism would be to extend, not to limit the suffering to those qualities of thinking and of consciousness, and to human being as such also might solve the problem with anthropocentric perspective, not only male-centric, but anthropocentric. Like, why necessary this is the worst suffering? The consciousness is the worst suffering. And there's so many possible ways, possible manifestations of suffering, and asking questions that don't have answer, like meaning of life, is not the worst out of it. The worst one probably personally is love. Well, I don't want to reduce, because it's problematic side to reduce women to mothers and the reproductive capacities and all of this reproductive complex, but none the way there is a horror of giving birth to someone who is destined to die, like something like that. The horror of that I understand that you need consciousness to comprehend all that, but still it just a certain quality, and it might be much more broader than just the consciousness that is the quality of reflecting that is associated exclusively with humans, mostly with males. But the whole thing, if you want to make, if it's even possible, make depressive realism and philosophical pessimism more feminist, if this possible, because it might not be possible. It's like inherently, structurally male-centered. But we might say at least that there are so many sources of, not sources, but manifestations of suffering. The world might be seen as in pain. And us in our pain not being extracted from the world that is inherently blissful, but actually in touch with the world, with the tragedy of existence of the world. So that's different form of thinking, that our tragedy of our existence, our consciousness, makes us separate from nature, from the world. That's how we normally think. Everyone would tend to think about, in philosophy, would tend to think about consciousness as some kind of extraction of human being from nature. Something went wrong, something is too much, we suffer, we're not supposed to, let's be like more like animals, get rid of the sin of consciousness. What if it's the other way around? It's rather that's how we include it in the world. through suffering, how we resonate with the world. We actually realistic about what is going on with the world through the consciousness or other bridge. Or what if we don't suffer more? What if we suffer less, for example? That one of the ideas that Lacan might be suggesting when he's talking about angst, that it's at least a form of, it might be seen as form of reducing suffering to feeling, a way of containing it in a way. Unlike for example, lilies who don't have this ability. Although Lacan imply the different things, it's hard to comprehend. And he can be, of course, accused, and he should be accused in this idea that we are different from nature, because nature, everything is fine, and the human subject is kind of deviation from the nature. So but there are other interesting things about him if you develop him in different, more negative direction and more feminist, if it's possible. I'm not sure.
So, you mentioned, Zapffer in his sort of tongue-in-cheek commandments at the end of Last Messiah, where he's on about this antinatalist position, where he's playing on the Christian notion of be fruitful and multiply. He sort of reverses that in this coy way. I'm interested then, is your answer to sort of antinatalists like Benatar, who would say, don't procreate because you're procreating into suffering, is to say, well, that is existence. So to say that is to say something actually that they don't realize that they're saying, which is to just... So their argument is, it's better to never have been because existence is suffering, and that they are then... Would you say that people like Benatar and antinatalists of this type are beginning from a sort of position that, that's an error, that's bad, and really that is just existence, so they're not really saying anything at all in that way?
Some kind people would ask me why I would never commit suicide, because this is what seems I would imply was my negative way of thinking, like the reasonable thing to do. And antinatalism would be seen as a similar thing that follows as the conclusion from the negative pessimistic thinking. And that's what certain philosopher like Zapffer would actually imply as a solution. For me, in this comprehension, you see death as something that unfolds, something that happens at the end of life, and something that is different to life, something negative, unlike life that is positive. But for me, death is more like for Heidegger, death in his concept of being towards death is something that unfolds in life, happening in life, the nothingness as the limit of life unfolding into life. Life as a project which is determined by its opposite, by the limit of it. So the actual death, the biological death, wouldn't be actual death in this sense, because it's just the end of everything. So this, he also called anxiety dying in life, which is also has the idea that this death that you live through. And this is how I basically comprehend life as undergo, not only me, but this is how it is actually. We just prefer to call it life. But like calling it dying is the same thing. You could perfectly describe it, what you call life, as you optimistically see it as the opposite of death. It's also at the same time approaching death, and you can see that it's death unfolding in life. You approaching life. It's defined, approaching death. It's defined by you dying. Every moment that you're alive, you're also dying. So to destroy humanity, to get rid of your own existence, your own life, would be to stop this process. You paradoxically get rid of death, the dying, you shorten it. Yay! It's like solution. You don't go through all the suffering that life, what we call life, is offering you. And all the things associated with life and life, empowering of life, especially reproductive capacities, like women giving birth to children. It's so obvious for us. It's about creation. It's about there's more life, more humans, more seems like something creative and opposite of dying. But it can be seen as unfoldment of death. There's so much destruction and death in motherhood, parenthood, so much horror in all of these things that we try to see in a positive light, because the mother sacrificed her, you can say, body to a child. The child exists on expense of mother's energy, and it's very obvious at the beginning, and especially at the beginning, but throughout all the process of parenthood, which is ideally all of the parent's life. So, and you give birth to someone who will also undergo a process of self-destruction immediately. It would start to approach, and it's much more horrifying than your own limit, understanding that you can never sustain life or give birth to life. You only give birth to death, something that the death that unfolds, and then that's the horror. It's even more horrifying than the idea of one's own suffering, one's own death. For Heidegger wasn't able to get it, even though he had kids. But maybe it's different if you spend more time with your kids, like Heidegger did. He had a wife who was mostly taking care of them. But for Heidegger, death is the point of individualization, and it's one's own death. Like, you're lonely. It's about you. You're lonely in your existence, and this is what your death shows you, especially the being towards death. If you follow it, if this is your way of life, then you're properly, authentically individualized. I think that the death is never your own, one's own death. I don't think it causes us so much suffering when we consider our own death. It's rather a relief, like the solution. So much life in this idea of death, so much relief, very positive. But the death and of others, not death, but loss of them. It's not necessary even person have to be biologically dead, the dead body, but it's horrible. But the death of relationship, for example, or the suffering of the person who you love, that's so much more horrible than your own death. And so many instances when you would perhaps prefer dying than going through certain things. So death is rather, in this sense, is a relief and solution to all the horror that we go through in our everyday life.
Well, I sort of hate to ask this because it's going to come across as if I haven't been listening to it at all. But I'm sure people do ask you this after reading your book. What is to be done? Is anything to be done? Or I guess maybe a way to rephrase that then would be: is there anything to be done that you don't see as subordinating itself to positivity? Is there a vector of creative nothing, of creative negativity?
That's a horrible question to ask me, because that's what I'm trying to not to do, not to provide any solutions. So I'm trying to trick thinking that is positively oriented in a way that it will accept negativity without offering any positivity in terms of solutions and improvement, because this is something that I see as an escape from it. But it ultimately fails all the time, because probably for someone who is living still, one needs to extend their dying through introducing some positivity into it. And my favorite way to fail, to be properly negative, to offer some kind of improvement or something that can be done, is to see embrace of negativity as something that contributes to solidarity, genuine understanding of other human being. Because from my perspective that I try to elaborate, human being is essentially constitutively negative. Like, there's the dark heart of anxiety within each of us, and to truly see the heart of the other is to meet them in their anxiety, in their negative states, and not to escape from it, even though it's very hard and quite destructive for both whoever are doing it. But which implies that this not trying to escape from, to stigmatize negativity, like depression, in you and in others, not trying to fix each other, would imply more solidarity, more genuine connection with the other. But still, this is problematic statement because it implies some kind of the world is going to get better if we do so and so, if we embrace something. And this is what I wasn't intended to do first. And the opposite problem is that any things that I criticize, this overly positive society, the stigmatization of depression, ways of avoiding not seeing the pain of the other, all of those things that are positive and that I criticize are at the same time surprise negative because this way of dealing with negativity, trying to escape it, to stigmatize it, to do something with it, is at the same time dealing within a space of negativity. If it's constitutive, you cannot escape from it. And whatever you do, you operating within the field of negativity. Even psychiatry, psychology, which defines depression as deviation from how it's supposed to be, still talking about depression. It's a way of including depression into language, even though in a way of rejecting it, because maybe there are no other ways of including it. And all the most positive things, like it's salvation in Christianity or whatever, the greatest happy ending, it's still a way of knowing the opposite in a way. The very need of saying it implies that there's something wrong and we need to be reassured just in case. And all the structure, the grandiose structure of a church or whatever, just shows how desperate we are. And all the professional tone of psychiatry, for example, the white robe, also can be seen as the despair of dealing with the negativity. So my project is a failure because first, it's impossible to include negativity and to fully embrace negativity without without adding certain positive qualities to it. And second, it's a failure because it's already happening and nothing else is happening except for the embrace of negativity within all the structures that I'm criticizing.
So an adjacent question to that, because I believe when I was looking at your website, you have people who are sort of trained in negative psychoanalysis now. So what does a negative psychoanalytical session look like? It's difficult, right? Because as soon as I talk about it being different, you're acknowledging that positive, negative thing. So it's different to talk. As soon as you say the word negativity, you're embracing that false error that you don't want to enter into. So, but yeah, what does it kind of look like in its difference?
Yeah, this is another failure, but this segment of my failure that I make money on. So the idea is initially to offer certain alternative to positively oriented practices, which are all the practices, especially psychological practice, that stigmatize negativity and try to alienate it from you. Instead, negative practice is supposed to be a way of looking at least for a way of embracing it. I would also say that we are failing together in embracing because it's substantially important. And I'm teaching people that, but understanding it doesn't make sense. And that psychology is also doing it. But embracing negativity, I mean, but in a bit less genuine way. So, yeah, that's the strange thing that I do for money. If you want to help me with this, you can advertise.
Okay. Well, I'll put links for the book and your site in the description below. Is there anything you'd like to add about negative psychoanalysis that you feel is key, or are you working on where this might lead, another book, or?
The academic book is problematic format for me, and for now at least, I don't think I want to fail again in this format, but maybe different format in non-academic language that I appreciate more. And I'm teaching currently course on how to be negative, which is also, it's 1 year demotivational course that won't give you answer how to be negative, but we are discussing various topics on looking for an answer, even though it's kind of a wrong question, because it's still imposing a certain type of how to exist. But it's interesting thing to develop. And I'm thinking about ways of making it more feminist, all the pessimistic thinking, kind of redirecting it in a more feminist approach, which I think will make depressive realism and philosophical pessimism more depressive and more pessimistic. Hopefully, like it's a better version, more darkness into it. Unlike it's normally thought, like women associated with something more positive and more life and more happiness. Might be the opposite, more death and more destruction, and still associated with love and reproduction, but there is so much horror in those things. And so I still do the negative practice and teach people to be negative practitioners, while no one knows what exactly it means, which is the pressure thing about it.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your work that you feel is key that we should touch upon?
No, I advertise myself enough.
Okay. Well, Julia Reshe, thanks very much.
Thank you, James.